On a Saturday in September 1976, Jesse Hadfield drove a rusted flatbed truck up the gravel drive of the Hadfield farm in Milan County, Illinois, and he parked it where his father used to park, not because he was sentimental, but because it was the only spot that felt like a decision. On the bed of that truck sat a 1959 Massey Ferguson 72 combine that looked like it had been bought with bad luck, and maybe it had. Jesse was 19, sunburned, thin in the way farm kids get when they live on coffee and stubbornness, and he climbed down without making a show of it. He didn't wave at the house. He didn't call out. He just stood there long enough to let the engine tick itself quiet. Then he looked across the fields as if he was checking whether the land still recognized him. Ed Hadfield was on the porch when Jesse turned around. Ed was 68, tall, heavy-shouldered, dressed the same way he dressed for years. Clean overalls, seed company cap, face set like it had been carved and left to dry. He did not come down the steps right away. He watched Jesse the way a man watches a fence post in a windstorm. Not hoping, not praying, just waiting to see if it breaks. Jesse wiped his hands on his jeans because that's what people do when they need their hands to look like they belong somewhere. "Morning, Grandpa," he said. Ed didn't answer the greeting. His eyes went to the combine, then to Jesse, then back to the combine like he was trying to decide which one offended him more. "What is that?" Ed said finally. "Massey Ferguson," Jesse said. 72. "I bought it down in Peoria. I can see what it is." Ed's voice had no anger in it, which somehow made it worse. "I'm asking you why it's on my property." Jesse swallowed once. "Because I'm here to work." Ed's jaw tightened. "You're here to play farmer," he said. Jesse didn't react like a kid trying to win an argument. He reacted like someone who had been preparing for that sentence for a long time. "I'm here to harvest the corn," he said, and he kept his voice level, like if he raised it, he might lose control of his own hands. Ed stepped off the porch, slow and deliberate, as if he didn't want the boards to creak under him. He walked to the truck, ran a hand along the combine's side panel, and left a streak through the dust. He didn't need to open the engine bay to know the shape of the story. "How much?" he asked. "420, Jesse said. Ed let out a sound that wasn't a laugh. "Exactly. More like air leaving a tire." "You got robbed," he said. Jesse looked at him and didn't blink. "I got what I could afford," he said. That was the first time Ed's eyes sharpened. Not because Jesse was brave, but because he was serious. "Afford," Ed repeated. "You got money?" Jesse said, "Not much." Ed nodded, still studying the machine. "Then you got no business trying to run 320 acres. Jesse opened his mouth, but Ed raised a hand like a stop sign. "Before you start talking about your father," Ed said, "you're going to listen to me." He walked past Jesse and toward the machine shed without telling Jesse to follow. Jesse followed anyway. The shed smelled like old oil and chain grease and something else, something that always lives in buildings where men have spent their lives trying to keep machines alive. Effort that never gets seen. Ed went to a corner where a John Deere 4320 sat under a tarp like a body under a sheet. Jesse's throat tightened when he saw it, because he'd seen photos of his dad standing next to that tractor, smiling like he'd finally become the person he wanted to be. Ed did not touch the tarp. He did not look under it. He looked at Jesse. "Your father died on that thing," he said. He didn't say it with drama. He said it like a fact in a ledger. He died because he wanted new and fast and financed. Jesse's mouth went dry. Ed pointed back toward the yard. "Now you show up with a junk combine and a head full of ideas," he said. "And you think I'm going to hand you land because your blood matches mine." Jesse felt heat rising in his neck. "Dad wrote me," he said. "He wanted me here." Ed's eyes flashed, but not with hurt. With warning. "Don't do that," Ed said. "Don't use him like a crowbar." Jesse's hands clenched. "I'm not using him," he said. "I'm telling you why I came." Ed stepped closer. "You came because you're 19, and you think a farm is a story where the boy proves the old man wrong," he said. "But this isn't a story. This is corn in the field. Weather. Steel. Money. And men who get buried." Jesse held his ground, but the muscles around his jaw jumped. Ed stared at him for a long moment, and something in Ed's face shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a man deciding to do something he doesn't want to do because it's the only thing left that still resembles love. "All right," Ed said. "Here it is." He turned and walked back out into the light. Jesse followed him to the truck. Ed stopped beside the combine and spoke in a steady voice, the way he spoke when he was giving instructions that weren't up for discussion. "You want a farm?" Ed said. "Then you get 1 season." Jesse's chest tightened. "1 season," Ed repeated. "You harvest my corn. All 320 acres. You do it with that machine you dragged in here." Jesse opened his mouth, but Ed cut him off again. "No help," Ed said. "No borrowing my equipment. No hiring a custom crew. No calling the neighbors. No shortcuts." Jesse nodded slowly, because part of him couldn't believe this was even being offered, and part of him knew a trap when he heard one. Ed pointed toward the shed. "And you do not touch the John Deere," he said. "That tractor doesn't move." Jesse nodded again. Ed leaned in slightly, close enough that Jesse could smell coffee on his breath. "And there's one more rule," Ed said. "One rule above all." Jesse waited. Ed said it carefully, like he wanted Jesse to understand each word and remember it later when he was tired and scared and tempted. "If you borrow $1, Ed said, "you lose the farm." Jesse stared. "What?" he said. "You heard me," Ed said. $1. A loan. A signature. A note. Financing. Any of it. You borrow money to do this job, you're done. You pack up and you go back to Champaign or wherever you've been hiding. And you don't come back." Jesse's pulse thudded in his ears. "Why?" he asked, and he hated how small his voice sounded on that last word. Ed's face hardened. "Because debt is how farmers die," Ed said. "Sometimes it kills them slow. Sometimes it kills them fast. But it kills them." Jesse swallowed, then tried to steady himself by focusing on the rules, the tangible pieces. "And if I do it," he asked, "if I harvest it all, no borrowing, no help, I win?" Ed didn't answer right away. He looked past Jesse toward the fields as if he was watching the calendar crawl. "If you do it," Ed said, "I'll sign over 160 acres to you." "Half." Jesse's eyes widened. "Half," he repeated, and nodded once. "Half now," Ed said. "The other half, we'll see." Jesse wanted to argue, but he knew better than to argue with a deal that was already too big to be real. "And if I fail?" he asked. Ed's eyes returned to Jesse and held him there. "Then you leave," Ed said, "and you don't drag your father's name through my yard again." Jesse felt the weight of that. Not just the threat of losing land he didn't own yet, but the threat of losing the last remaining thread to his dad. "I'll do it," Jesse said too quickly. Ed studied him. "Say it like you mean it," Ed said. Jesse forced his voice to slow down. "I'll harvest all of it," he said. "No borrowing, no loans, no financing, no help." Ed nodded, as if hearing the words out loud made them real in a way they weren't yet. "Good," Ed said. Then he added, almost casually, "and I'll be watching." Jesse felt anger flare. "You think I can't?" he said. Ed's gaze didn't move. "I think you're 19, Ed said. "And I think you don't know what it feels like when a machine breaks and you got 200 acres still standing and the sky turns the color of a bruise." He paused. "And I think you don't know what it feels like when a man offers you an easy way out and you take it, and it follows you for the rest of your life." Jesse stared at him. "I won't borrow," he said. Ed nodded again. And then he turned and walked back toward the house like the conversation had been about a fence repair. Jesse stood alone by the combine, feeling both victorious and sick. A deal like that wasn't mercy. It was a test. He climbed back onto the truck bed and started unchaining the combine, because the fastest way to keep fear from swallowing you is to keep your hands busy. He had the machine on the ground by noon. He found the header was out of alignment. A belt looked frayed enough to snap if you breathed on it wrong. The grain tank had a patch job that made him laugh once, a sure dry sound. He didn't have the luxury of feeling insulted by how bad it was. He crawled under it with a wrench set and a cheap flashlight and started working. That first night, he slept in the cab of his truck because he didn't want to step into the house and feel like a guest. In the dark, he pulled a shoebox from behind the seat and opened it. Letters. His dad's handwriting. Talk about fields and yields and plans and the future like it was a sure thing. Jesse read one letter until the paper softened from his thumb, rubbing the fold. Then he put it back and stared up through the windshield at the stars, trying not to think about the rule Ed had made the centerpiece of the whole bet. Don't borrow. It should have been easy. Jesse hated debt, too. Debt was what his mother blamed for everything after the divorce, even when the bills were really just the symptom and not the disease. Debt was what his dad had chased when he thought speed could outrun caution. But Jesse also knew how the world worked. Machines cost money. Parts cost money. Time costs money. And in farming, time is the one thing you can't refinance. The next morning, he got the Perkins diesel to cough awake after an hour of bleeding lines and cursing quietly, and he let it idle like an old dog that might bite if you got too confident. It did not come out. Jesse took that as a message. You want this, you do it without an audience. On Tuesday, September 14th, Jesse rolled into the first row and started his first pass. The combine rattled like it wanted to come apart, but corn went in. Not clean, not pretty, but it went in. Jesse kept his speed low and his eyes sharp. 3 acres in, the belt snapped. Jesse shut down, climbed off, and stood there staring at the brake like it had personally insulted him. The simplest failure can feel like betrayal when you're already carrying too much. He walked back toward the shed, and that's when he saw Ed's rule in its real form. Inside the shed, parts were stacked and labeled and stored with a kind of obsessive care. Belts, bearings, chains, coffee cans full of bolts. Ed had what Jesse needed, but the deal said no borrowing equipment, not no borrowing parts, and that gray area would matter later, because tests always start with small compromises. Jesse found a belt that matched, replaced it by late afternoon, and got 2 more acres done before dark. He harvested 5 acres on the first day and felt like he'd run a marathon on gravel. On Wednesday, he made it to 7. On Thursday, 9. He started to learn the machine's moods. He was doing the math constantly. 320 acres. 10 a day if he was lucky. Rain would come. Something big would fail. He would need money. He could feel the pressure building in his chest like a hand tightening. Friday afternoon, he drove into town for a hose fitting and a set of filters. He told himself he was just being practical, that it was better to have what he needed before he needed it. He parked in front of Gunderson's Feed and Supply, because that's where men went when they wanted news and judgment in equal portions. Inside, the counter talk slowed the moment he walked in. That's another thing young people don't understand until it happens. Adults don't have to say you're a joke for you to feel it. It lives in pauses and side glances and the way someone holds back a smile. Dale Gunderson nodded to him. Jesse, he said, like he was trying to be kind but didn't know how. 2 other men were there. Tom Pfeiffer, who farmed 600 acres north of town, and Carl Brandt, the John Deere dealer from Normal, thick neck, confident hands, the kind of man who could make debt sound like opportunity. Carl looked Jesse up and down and smiled. Heard you're out there running Ed's harvest, Carl said. Jesse kept his voice even. I'm harvesting, he said. Carl chuckled. With that old Massey? Jesse didn't answer fast. He could feel his own pride rising, and pride was dangerous because it made you talk. With what I've got, Jesse said. Carl leaned forward, lowering his voice like he was about to give friendly advice. Son, he said, I got a used 6600 on the lot. Good machine. 2 years old. You be done in 2 weeks. I can get you financed today. Jesse felt his stomach drop because it was too early for the temptation to show up this clean. Carl reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card, slid it across the counter with 2 fingers. I'm not talking about burying you, Carl said. Small note. Easy payment. We do this all the time. Harvest first, pay later. Jesse stared at the card. He didn't touch it. In his mind, he heard Ed's voice like a door slamming. If you borrow $1, you lose the farm. Carl watched him and smiled like he already knew Jesse would fold, because that's what most people do when the easy way is placed in their hand like a warm coffee. Jesse felt every eye in the store on him, waiting for the kid to either get smart or get humbled. And that is where this story really starts, not in a field, not on a machine, but in a feed store with a piece of paper on a counter, because the combine was never the real problem. The real problem was what happens when you're tired and you're scared and someone offers you a way to stop suffering. Jesse's hand hovered above the card for a second, not because he wanted the debt, because he wanted the relief, because he wanted to stop being the kid everyone expected to fail. He pulled his hand back and looked Carl Brandt in the eye. My grandfather made me one promise, Jesse said quietly. If I borrow money, I'm done. Carl's smile thinned. Your grandfather's stubborn, Carl said. Stubborn doesn't harvest corn. Jesse stared at him, feeling the heat in his chest turn into something colder and sharper. "Stubborn is the only thing I've got," Jesse said. Then he picked up his coffee, turned, and walked out of Gunderson's without the filters he'd come for, because if he stayed one more minute, he might take that car just to prove he wasn't afraid, and that's how people ruin their lives. Not by being weak, but by pretending they're not. He drove back to the farm with his jaw clenched so hard it hurt. The sky ahead was clear. The weather was still on his side. For now. But the offer had landed inside him like a splinter. He could pretend he hadn't been tempted, but he'd be lying. And out in the yard, the old combine waited, rattling, leaking, demanding. Jesse climbed down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and went back under the machine because he didn't have the luxury of thinking about the future when the present was held together with bolts that were already tired. Somewhere behind a window, Ed Hadfield watched, unreadable. And somewhere in town, Carl Brandt told himself the kid would be back. They always came back when the rain came. The next morning, Jesse woke before the sun because sleep had started to feel like a liability. He lay there in a cab for a moment, listening to the cooling metal of the combine tick in the dark, and tried to separate fear from logic. 5 acres the first day, 7 the second, 9 the third. The numbers were climbing, but not fast enough to quiet the voice that kept reminding him 320 acres didn't care how determined he felt. He climbed out, washed his face with water from a jug, and went straight to the machine. He didn't check the house. He didn't look for Ed. If the old man was watching, he could watch. Jesse had decided something the night before in town when Carl Brandt slid that card across the counter. He had decided that the real test wasn't the acreage. It was endurance. The machine coughed to life after a few stubborn cranks, diesel smoke hanging low in the morning air, and Jesse drove it toward the field without ceremony. He kept his speed low, steady, resisting the temptation to push harder just to feel like he was making progress. By mid-morning, the left side began to shudder in a way that told him something was misaligned again. He shut down, climbed down, and crawled underneath with a wrench in his teeth. Sweat ran into his eyes, and he let it, because frustration was a luxury he couldn't afford. He tightened what he could, hammered what he couldn't, and climbed back up. 10 acres that day, 11 the next. He began to find a rhythm. Harvest until something snapped, fix it, harvest again, eat standing up, sleep when the body forced it. The pattern was mechanical, almost comforting because as long as he was moving, he didn't have to think about the rule hanging over him like a storm cloud. Don't borrow $1. It sounded simple when spoken on a porch. It felt different when a hydraulic hose split open at 3 in the afternoon and oil sprayed across your boots, and you knew you had maybe $40 left in your pocket. Jesse drove into town again on Thursday, this time straight to the parts store. He kept his head down, paid cash for a used hose, counted the change twice. He could feel eyes on him even when no one spoke. Word traveled fast in Milan County. By Friday afternoon, everyone knew Ed Hadfield's grandson was trying to harvest 320 acres with a machine older than he was and no money to back it. The second offer came that evening, not from Carl directly, but from a man who worked the counter at the dealership and thought he was being helpful. "You don't have to tell your granddad," he said quietly when Jesse stopped in to price a bearing. "We can structure it through crop advance. He never has to know." That was the first time the temptation shifted from convenience to secrecy. It felt dirtier. It felt easier. Jesse stared at the counterman for a long second and then said, "If I have to hide it, it's already wrong." The man shrugged like youth was something that could be cured with time and bad decisions. Jesse drove back to the farm angry at himself for even considering it. The combine ran rough that evening, the engine knocking slightly under load, and Jesse kept thinking about how much smoother a newer machine would sound, how much faster it would eat through rows. He imagined finishing weeks early, imagined walking into the house and telling Ed it was done, imagined not feeling like he was racing a clock that never slowed down. That imagination scared him more than the breakdowns. Saturday brought wind and a thin line of clouds low on the horizon. By noon, the sky had changed color in a way Jesse didn't like. He shut down early and checked the radio in the truck. Rain moving in. 3 days, maybe 4. He did the math in his head. He had cleared 73 acres. 247 left. Rain meant delay. Delay meant pressure. Pressure meant mistakes. That night, he slept lighter than usual, waking every hour to the sound of wind hitting the side of the cab. The rain came hard Sunday morning and did not let up. It drummed on metal and pooled in low spots in the yard. Jesse sat in the truck watching water collect in the ruts and felt something tight in his chest start to twist. Rain wasn't dramatic. It didn't explode. It just stole time quietly. On Monday, he walked the edge of the field in boots that sank too deep and tried not to imagine mold creeping into the standing corn. He checked the combine again, retightened bolts that didn't need tightening, changed oil that could have lasted another week. He needed to move. By Tuesday afternoon, the rain slowed to a drizzle. The forecast said clearing by Wednesday. Jesse calculated again. If the fields dried in 2 days, he could restart Friday. That would leave him maybe 25 working days before the usual hard freeze. 25 days for 247 acres. He would need to average almost 10 a day without losing another full day to repairs. It was possible. Barely. Wednesday night, Carl Brandt drove up the gravel lane in a clean pickup that looked out of place next to Jesse's rusted truck. Jesse was under the combine again when he saw headlights cut across the yard. He wiped his hands and stood as Carl stepped out, smiling like he was visiting a friend. "Evening," Carl said. Jesse nodded. "Evening." Carl glanced at the machine, at the muddy yard, at the sky. "Rain's cost you 3 days," he said casually. "Forecast says another system next week." Jesse didn't answer. Carl walked closer, lowering his voice. "I can have that 6,600 here tomorrow," he said. "No payment until after harvest. We're at it clean. Your grandfather doesn't have to sign anything. It's between you and me." There was again, not just money, secrecy, independence. Carl leaned in slightly. "You're working hard," he said. "Nobody's questioning that. But working hard and working smart aren't always the same thing." Jesse felt the weight of that sentence settle in. He knew Carl wasn't wrong about efficiency. He also knew this wasn't just about efficiency. "I gave my word," Jesse said quietly. Carl sighed like a man disappointed in a student. "Your word won't matter if you fail," he said. "Corn won't wait for pride." Jesse looked past Carl toward the house. He didn't see Ed in the window, but he knew the old man was aware of the truck in the yard. "If I fail," Jesse said, "I fail my way." Carl studied him for a moment, then shook his head. "You're going to break that machine," he said. "And when you do, you'll come find me." He turned, climbed back into his pickup, and drove away, leaving tire tracks in the mud. Jesse stood there long after the taillights disappeared. The rain had stopped, but the air felt heavier. Friday morning the fields were still soft, but Jesse couldn't wait any longer. He eased the combine back into the first row and felt the tires sink slightly before catching traction. The engine labored. He kept his speed steady. The first few passes went well enough that hope began to creep back in, cautious and fragile. By mid-afternoon, he had cleared 12 acres, his best single day so far. He allowed himself a small exhale. Then, near the edge of the north field, the engine sputtered. It didn't die immediately. It coughed again, and then lost power like someone had shut off a valve. Jesse killed the ignition and sat there in silence. He tried again. The starter turned. Nothing. He tried a third time. Nothing. He felt the first flicker of real fear. He climbed down and opened the side panel, checked the obvious. Fuel line clear. Filters new. He bled the line and tried again. The engine turned, but would not fire. Injection pump. He knew it before he wanted to admit it. The injection pump wasn't a belt or a hose. It wasn't something you fixed with wire and a hammer. It was precision. It was money. Jesse leaned back against the tire and stared across the field. He counted his cash in his head. Maybe $300 left. Maybe less. He walked back to the truck and grabbed the radio, called every parts dealer within range. Nobody had one in stock. One salvage yard in Terre Haute had a rebuilt pump. $350. Cash. He felt the ground shift under him in a way that had nothing to do with mud. $350 would clean him out, and that assumed the pump worked. He looked at the combine sitting silent in the field and felt the weight of Ed's rule pressed down harder than it ever had. Don't borrow $1. He could drive to Carl's dealership, right now. Carl would have paperwork ready. By tomorrow, he'd be running again with a newer machine and a lighter mind. He could tell himself it was temporary. He could tell himself he'd pay it off quick. He could tell himself Ed would understand once the corn was in. That's how it starts, he thought. Not with greed, with justification. He climbed into his truck and sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at the road that led toward town. The sky had cleared. The field was quiet. He could feel the decision building inside him like pressure behind a dam. Borrow and finish fast. Or pay cash, empty his pockets, and pray nothing else broke. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel and closed his eyes for a second longer than he meant to. Somewhere in the house, behind a window, Ed Hadfield stood still, watching the truck in the yard, waiting to see which direction it would turn. Jesse kept his hands on the steering wheel long enough for the choice to stop feeling theoretical. The road to town was straight. He could see it from where he sat. Gravel, then pavement, then the dealership lot with its neat rows of green machines that didn't rattle and didn't leak and didn't make a 19-year-old question whether pride was worth the cost. He started the truck. That alone felt like a decision. The engine idled rough, mirroring the one dead in the field behind him. He put in gear and rolled forward slowly, tires crunching over gravel. He told himself he was going to Terre Haute for the pump. That was true. Mostly. The turnoff toward town came first. He slowed as he approached it. His mind began doing what minds do under pressure, building arguments that sound responsible. It's not weakness. It's leverage. You can't finish without equipment. Your grandfather's rule is outdated. He won't know. You'll pay it off in one season. He tightened his grip until his knuckles whitened. Then he drove straight past the turn. He did not look toward town. He drove 3 hours to Terre Haute in near silence, stopping once for gas and counting the bills in his pocket twice before he went inside to pay. The salvage yard was rows of dead machines, lined up like a museum of hard lessons. The man at the counter brought out the rebuilt injection pump, wrapped in newspaper, and set it down with the indifference of someone who had seen too many hopeful buyers. $3.50, he said. Jesse counted the money out slowly, feeling the weight of each bill leaving his hand. When the last one slid across the counter, he understood something clearly. He now had no cushion, no margin. If anything else broke, he would have nothing left but the rule. He drove back through the night, headlights cutting a narrow path through darkness, and pulled into the farm close to midnight. The house was dark. The yard was still. He climbed out, carried the pump to the combine, and set on the fender like something fragile. The bolts on the old unit were corroded and stubborn. Two snapped when he tried to back them out. He cursed under his breath, drilled them out by flashlight, hands shaking not from cold, but from the awareness that he was one mistake away from turning this into scrap. By 3 a.m, he had the new pump seated. By 4, he had bled the lines. At 5:47, the engine fired. It ran rough at first, then steadied into something that almost sounded grateful. Jesse leaned back against the tire and let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped inside him for days. He did not look toward the house. He did not need to. He knew Ed would hear it. He was back in the field by 7. He drove harder that day, 14 acres before sunset. It was the best day he'd had, and it came at the exact moment he had no money left. The following week became a blur of repetition and calculation. Wake up before dawn. Check fluids. Tighten bolts. Harvest until dark. Fix what broke. Sleep 4 hours. Repeat. The rain had cost him time, and he drove like a man trying to steal it back. He cleared 148 acres by the end of the 3rd week, slightly ahead of the pace he'd recalculated after the delay. That small victory felt dangerous. Confidence invites carelessness. On the 4th morning, the hydraulic pressure dropped mid-row. The header lowered slower than it should. Jesse shut down and traced the line, found a small weeping crack near a fitting. He patched it temporarily with tape and wire, knowing it wouldn't hold long. He had $12 left. 12. The knowledge sat in his gut like a stone. He finished the row and drove to the edge of the field, staring at the machine. $12 meant no new hose. It meant no surprise repairs. It meant if something larger failed, the only remaining option would be the one rule he'd sworn not to break. That afternoon, Carl Brandt returned. Not with a smile this time. With patience. He parked at the edge of the field and waited until Jesse shut down. Jesse climbed down slowly. "You're bleeding oil," Carl said, nodding toward the taped line. Jesse didn't answer. Carl stepped closer. "You think I don't know what this looks like?" he said quietly. "I've watched men try to out stubborn physics before." Jesse wiped his hands on a rag. "I paid cash for the pump," he said, not sure why he felt the need to say it. Carl raised an eyebrow. "So you're broke," he replied. It wasn't an insult. It was a fact. Jesse didn't deny it. Carl lowered his voice. "This isn't about pride anymore," he said. "This is about finishing. I can have you running a cleaner machine by tomorrow. No down payment. First we'll do next year." Jesse looked past Carl toward the rows still standing. "And if I don't pay?" he asked. Carl shrugged slightly. "Then we talk. Then we restructure. That's business." Jesse studied him. "That's debt," he said. Carl didn't flinch. "Debt isn't evil," he said. "It's a tool." Jesse felt anger flicker. "Tools don't bury people," he said. Carl's jaw tightened. "Weather buries people," he replied. "Broken machines bury people. Stubborn old men bury people." That last sentence hung between them. Jesse's pulse spiked. He wanted to defend Ed. He wanted to agree with Carl. Both feelings felt like betrayal. "I made a deal," Jesse said finally. Carl stepped closer, almost pleading now. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "Your grandfather won't live forever. You think he'll thank you for wrecking his crop to prove a point?" That hit deeper than Carl knew. Jesse looked back at the combine, at the patched hose, at the dust caked into every seam. "If I borrow," Jesse said slowly, "I lose everything." Carl exhaled sharply. "No," he said. "You lose a bet. You keep the farm because you finished." Jesse shook his head once. "You don't understand," he said. "The bet is the farm." Carl stared at him a long moment, then stepped back. "When that machine quits again," he said quietly, "I'll be in town." He left without another word. Jesse stood alone in the field as the sun dipped lower. The hydraulic patch held through 2 more days. On the third, it failed completely. Oil sprayed across the header. The lift froze mid-row. Jesse shut down and felt something in his chest finally crack. He had no money, no hose, no cushion. He could not harvest without hydraulics. He walked back to the truck slowly, every step heavy. He sat in the driver's seat and stared at his empty wallet. $12. Not enough for the part. Not enough for fuel. Not enough for anything. The rule echoed in his head again. If you borrow $1, you lose the farm. He thought about driving to town and asking Carl for the machine. He thought about telling himself it was temporary. He thought about finishing early and handing Ed the keys in silence. He thought about his father's letters in the shoebox behind the seat. He reached back, pulled the box forward, opened it. The paper was worn thin at the folds. He read one line twice. "A man doesn't build a farm on speed. He builds it on what he can stand." Jesse closed his eyes. He wasn't sure whether his father meant physical endurance or something else. Maybe both. He stepped out of the truck and walked toward the house for the first time since the deal was made. He did not knock. He stood in the yard long enough that Ed opened the door without being called. They looked at each other across the distance. "Machine's down," Jesse said. Ed nodded once. "I heard." Jesse swallowed. "Hydraulic line," he said. Ed's face did not change. "You got money?" he asked. Jesse held up his wallet and shook it once. The sound was hollow. Ed studied him carefully, searching his face not for weakness, but for something else. "You go to town?" Ed asked. Jesse shook his head. "Not yet." The word hung there. Not yet meant temptation was still alive. Ed stepped off the porch and walked toward the field without another word. Jesse followed. They stood beside the combine in silence. Ed crouched, examined the line, ran a thumb along the split. He stood up slowly. "There's a hose in the shed," he said. Jesse stiffened. "That's borrowing," he said. Ed looked at him sharply. "Parts aren't loans," he replied. "Debt is." Jesse exhaled slowly. The distinction mattered. Ed turned toward the shed. "You're not done yet," he said. "Unless you want to be." Jesse followed him back, heart pounding, knowing this wasn't just about a hose anymore. It was about whether he would finish broke, battered, but clean, or finish faster, easier, and carrying something he would never be able to put down. Ed did not rush. That was the first thing Jesse noticed. The old man did not move like someone trying to rescue a failing operation. He moved like someone evaluating whether the man standing next to him had already made up his mind. They walked into the machine shed together, boots echoing against the concrete floor. Ed went straight to a rack along the back wall and reached up without hesitation, pulling down a coiled hydraulic hose that looked older than Jesse, but still intact. He held it in his hands for a moment before passing it over. "This isn't charity," Ed said evenly. "It's inventory." Jesse nodded once. He didn't trust himself to speak yet. They walked back to the combine and knelt beside it. Ed handed Jesse the wrench instead of taking it himself. That detail mattered. Jesse loosened the ruined hose slowly, careful not to strip the fitting. Ed watched his hands, not hovering, not correcting, just watching. It took 15 minutes to swap the line. Jesse tightened the last bolt and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Start it," Ed said. The engine turned, caught, and steadied. The header lifted smoothly. Jesse felt relief rise in his chest, but he forced it back down. Relief was temporary. He knew something bigger was coming. It always did. They harvested together that afternoon without speaking much. Ed did not climb into the cab. He walked the edge of the field, occasionally bending to check what was left behind. Jesse could feel his grandfather's presence without seeing him, like a weight at his back. They cleared another 13 acres before dark. That night, Jesse slept harder than he had in weeks. The next 5 days blurred into motion. Acres fell. Repairs stayed small. The engine burned oil faster now, and the left bearing near the threshing cylinder had begun making a faint whining sound that Jesse tried to ignore. He had learned that some noises meant immediate danger. Others were just warnings you carried until they became something worse. By October 25th, he had cleared 289 acres. 31 remained. 11 days until the average first freeze. On paper, he was going to make it. That thought scared him more than the risk of failure. Because once success becomes visible, pressure sharpens. The next morning, halfway through the first row, the whining sound turned into a scream. The combine jolted violently and locked up mid-pass. The engine stalled under the sudden resistance. Jesse killed the ignition and sat frozen for 3 seconds that felt longer than the entire season. He climbed down slowly, heart pounding. He didn't need to look long. The threshing cylinder bearing had seized. The housing had cracked. 2 drive belts had shredded themselves into black ribbons. He crouched there in the dirt staring at the damage. This wasn't a hose. This wasn't tape and wire territory. This was the heart of the machine. 31 acres left. He did the math again, even though it didn't help. If he drove to town now and borrowed, he could finish in a week. If he paid cash, he had none. If he quit, it was over. He sat down fully in the dirt and leaned back against the wheel. For the first time since this started, he let himself feel it. Not anger, not pride, just exhaustion. The kind that reaches past muscle into something quieter and more dangerous. He thought about walking to the truck, driving into town, and ending it. Not the harvest, the test. He could tell Ed he'd done enough. He could say physics won. He could blame timing. He could even tell himself that borrowing for 1 week didn't make him weak. The arguments lined up easily now, smoother than before. He heard footsteps before he saw boots. Ed walked into view carrying a steel toolbox in one hand and a coffee can in the other. He had not asked what happened. He crouched beside the open panel and looked in silence. He reached in, turned the cylinder slightly by hand, then withdrew his fingers slowly. "Bearing's gone," he said. Jesse nodded. "Housing cracked too," Jesse added. It grunted softly. He set the toolbox down and opened it. "Get the belts off," he said. Jesse looked at him sharply. "I can't afford," he started. Ed cut him off without raising his voice. "I didn't ask what you can afford," he said. "I said get the belts off." Jesse hesitated only a second before moving. They worked side by side without talking. Ed's hands were steady. Jesse noticed that. Not rushed, not angry, just steady. They pulled the cylinder assembly, lowered it carefully to the ground. Ed opened the coffee can and poured out a collection of bearings onto a rag. "New old stock," he said quietly. Been sitting since 68. Jesse stared. You knew, he said before he could stop himself. Ed glanced at him. I knew something would fail, he replied. It always does. Jesse swallowed. If I borrow now, he said carefully, I still lose. Ed met his eyes. You thinking about it? Jesse held the stare. I'm tired, he admitted. That was the first honest sentence he'd spoken in days. Ed nodded once. Good, he said. Means you're close. They pressed the ruined bearing out with effort and silence. It took longer than Jesse wanted. The cracked housing required welding. Ed handed him the torch. You do it, he said. Jesse hesitated. You're better at it. Ed's expression didn't change. You do it, he repeated. Jesse welded slowly, careful not to overheat the metal. The repair wouldn't be factory perfect. It didn't need to be. It needed to hold for 31 acres. Darkness crept in around them. They worked by portable light after sunset. At one point, Jesse's hands shook from fatigue and frustration. Ed reached over and steadied the housing without comment. Not correcting, supporting. They remounted the cylinder close to midnight. Replaced the belts. Tightened every bolt twice. Jesse wiped sweat and grease from his face with the back of his arm. Start it, Ed said again. The engine turned once. Twice. On the third, crank it fired. The machine vibrated, but did not seize. Jesse engaged the cylinder cautiously. It spun. No scream. No violent jolt. Just the low mechanical hum of something patched and stubborn. Jesse exhaled slowly. Ed stood up and closed the toolbox. It'll hold, he said. Jesse looked at him, searching for something more. Why didn't you just let me borrow? Jesse asked quietly. Ed didn't answer immediately. He stared out across the dark field where only 31 acres remained standing. Because if you borrow now, Ed said finally, you'll borrow again later. And the next time, you'll have a reason that sounds even better. Jesse absorbed that. Ed turned slightly toward him. You think this is about money, he continued. It's about who you become when it's hard. Jesse felt that land deeper than any lecture could. They stood there in silence for a moment. Then Ed added, almost as an afterthought, your father always wanted the faster way. I never showed him why I was afraid of it. I just said no. Jesse felt something shift in his chest. I'm not him, he said quietly. Ed looked at him directly. I know, he replied. Then he picked up the toolbox and started walking back toward the house. Jesse stood alone beside the combine, engine idling softly, and realized the real line had never been about $1. It had been about whether he could stand being this tired and still choose the harder path. He climbed back into the cab. 31 acres. The freeze was coming. The machine was wounded but alive. And for the first time since the bet was made, Jesse didn't feel like he was proving something to his grandfather. He felt like he was proving something to himself. He eased the combine forward into the next row, steady hands on the controls, knowing the final stretch would not forgive hesitation. The last stretch did not feel heroic. It felt narrow. Jesse woke before dawn every day that final week with the same thought pressing against his ribs. Don't let it break now. He didn't think about ownership anymore. He didn't think about the bet. He thought about bolts, temperature, oil pressure, the sound of the cylinder under load. He drove the combine like a man, handling something fragile and stubborn at the same time. 28 acres left, then 24. The weather held colder each morning. Frost clung to the fence posts at sunrise and melted by mid-morning, a quiet warning of what was coming. Jesse checked the forecast on the radio twice a day. Hard freeze expected November 3rd. He calculated without meaning to. He had until the 2nd, maybe the 3rd if he pushed through cold. He drove longer hours than before, but not recklessly. Fatigue makes men careless, and careless men lose more than crops. On October 30th, the engine burned nearly a quart of oil in 4 hours. Jesse refilled it without complaint. On the 31st, the welded housing groaned under strain but held. 10 acres left. That number felt smaller than it was. The first freeze advisory came over the radio late that afternoon. Jesse shut it off. He didn't need the reminder. He could feel the air tightening around him. November 1st, he cleared 6 acres before dark. 4 remained. He slept in the cab again that night, not because he had to, but because he didn't trust morning to wait for him. He woke before the alarm and started the engine in darkness. The combine hesitated for half a second that felt like judgment, then fired. He eased into the row carefully. The corn was dry. The machine was tired. So was he. By mid-morning, 2 acres remained. He could see the end from the cab now, the final standing stretch looking almost ordinary compared to what it had cost. He didn't speed up. He didn't rush the final passes. He let the machine work at the pace it could sustain. The last row ended at 3:48 in the afternoon. Jesse disengaged the header and sat there with his hands resting lightly on the wheel. The field was quiet. No crowd. No applause. Just cut stalks and the low idle of an engine that had survived more than it should have. He shut it down. The silence that followed was deeper than he expected. He climbed down slowly and stood on the ground without moving. The air was cold enough that his breath showed. He didn't feel triumph. He felt finished. Ed was standing near the grain wagon by the time Jesse drove the last load toward the elevator. He hadn't been there when Jesse started that morning. He was there now. They didn't speak while the grain auger ran. They didn't need to. When the final bushel cleared and the wagon emptied, Jesse cut the engine and stepped down. He was thinner than when he'd arrived. His hands were cut and dark with ground grease. His jeans were stiff with oil stains that wouldn't wash out. Ed walked toward him slowly. They stopped 2 feet apart. "You did it," Ed said. He didn't smile. He didn't clap him on the back. He just said it like a statement entered into record. Jesse nodded once. "Yes, sir," he replied. His voice didn't shake. He was too tired for that. Ed looked past him at the combine parked crooked in the yard. "She won't last another season without a rebuild," he said. Jesse followed his gaze. "I know," he said. "We'll fix it." Ed studied him carefully. "We?" he asked. Jesse hesitated. "If that's all right." Ed reached into his coat pocket slowly and pulled out an envelope that looked older than it should have been. The paper was yellowed at the edges. He held it between 2 fingers for a moment before handing it over. "I wrote that 2 years ago," he said quietly. "After your father." Jesse took it without speaking. His name wasn't on it. No address. Just a folded sheet inside. "Read it later," Ed said. "Not here." Jesse nodded and slipped it into his jacket. He expected something ceremonial next. A handshake. A declaration about acreage. Instead, Ed said, "Come inside." They walked into the house together for the first time since the deal began. The kitchen table looked the same as it always had. Ed pulled out a chair and sat. Jesse remained standing until Ed gestured for him to sit as well. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ed stood again and walked toward a cabinet near the hallway. He opened it, reached into the back, and pulled out a small metal cash box. He sat on the table and opened it with a key from his pocket. Inside were stacks of bills banded neatly. Jesse stared at them, confused. "What's that?" he asked quietly. Ed looked at him without blinking. "Your temptation," he said. Jesse frowned slightly. Ed leaned back in his chair. "There's enough in there to buy you a decent used combine outright," he continued. "Been sitting there since the day you showed up." Jesse felt something shift in his chest. "You had the money," he said slowly. Ed nodded once. "I had it," he confirmed. Silence settled between them. Jesse's mind raced back through every moment in town, every offer from Carl, every hour he'd spent under the machine bleeding and swearing and calculating $12. "Why?" Jesse asked finally. Ed folded his hands together on the table. "Because if I gave it to you on day one," he said, "you'd never know whether you could stand the hard part." Jesse stared at the cash, then back at his grandfather. "You could have told me," he said. Ed's jaw tightened slightly. "If I told you," he replied, "it wouldn't be a test." The word test hung in the air. Jesse felt anger rise for half a second, then drain just as quickly. "If I had borrowed," he asked quietly, "would you have stopped me?" Ed shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I would have let you sign." Jesse felt his stomach drop. "Then what?" he asked. Ed's voice remained level. "Then I would have known you weren't ready," he said. The simplicity of it hit harder than any lecture could have. Jesse looked down at his hands. They were still trembling slightly from fatigue. "I almost did," he admitted. Ed nodded once. "I know," he said. Jesse looked up sharply. Ed continued. "Carl came by twice when you were gone. Told me he'd seen you thinking." Jesse exhaled slowly. "You weren't going to step in," he said. Ed shook his head again. "No," he replied, "because this wasn't about corn." Silence filled the kitchen. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock. Jesse glanced at the envelope in his jacket pocket. "What's in that?" he asked. Ed looked toward it briefly. "A mistake," he said. Jesse waited. Ed continued after a moment, voice quieter now. "I wrote it after your father died," he said. "I realized I never showed him why I was afraid of death. I just fought him. Said no. Push him harder. He thought I didn't believe in him." Jesse swallowed. Ed's eyes remained steady. "I believed in him," he said. "I just didn't know how to say it without sounding like fear." The room felt smaller somehow. "And me?" Jesse asked carefully. Ed met his gaze. "I needed to see if you'd choose the hard way when the easy one made sense," he said. "Not because I wanted you to suffer. Because suffering without borrowing teaches you something borrowing never will." Jesse leaned back in the chair slowly. The weight of the season settled differently now. It wasn't just about endurance. It was about identity. "So what now?" Jesse asked. Ed closed the cash box and slid it back toward the cabinet. "Now," he said, "I sign over 160 acres like I promised." He paused. "And when I'm gone, the rest is yours." Jesse didn't respond immediately. He looked around the kitchen, at the worn table, the cabinet doors, the floor that had been walked across by 3 generations. "I don't want it because I want to bet," he said quietly. Ed's mouth twitched slightly, almost a smile, but not quite. "Good," he said. "Then you're ready." They signed papers the following week without ceremony. No announcement in town. No speech. Carl Brandt drove out once more before winter set in. He stood beside the battered combine and shook his head slowly. "You prove your point," he said. Jesse shrugged. "I proved I could finish," he replied. Carl looked toward the house. "Your grandfather's different," he said quietly. Jesse nodded once. "He always was." The freeze came that night. Hard and clean. The fields stood harvested. The machine sat silent in the shed, scarred and welded and held together by effort instead of financing. Years later, when the farm crisis of the 80s swept through Milan County and men who had borrowed during the good years found themselves drowning in notes they couldn't service, the Hadfield farm remained small and paid for. Carl Brandt survived barely. Others didn't. Jesse never financed a machine. When he finally replaced the Massey, he paid cash. The old combine stayed in the shed long after it stopped running, not because it was useful, but because it had settled something that needed settling. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, Jesse would open the drawer in his desk where he kept that envelope and read the line that mattered most, the one his grandfather had written years before the bet was ever made. "Don't just tell him no. Let him choose."